Darren had always been the star of his family. Born into a prestigious family of high-ranking officials, his life had been one of luxury, privilege, and status. But now, all of that was gone. It wasn't his fault. At least not entirely. His family believed in strict discipline and tradition. One mistake, one moment of rebellion, and suddenly Darren found himself cast aside. His world had crumbled in an instant when he made the wrong choice, one that went against the family's values. The decision had been made quickly. There would be no forgiveness. The punishment? Something far more bizarre than he could have ever imagined. Instead of simply being banished or disgraced, Darren would be married. Not to any noblewoman or a person of high rank. No, his punishment was more personal, more humiliating. His family had decided he would marry an alien, a slave no less. An alien woman, seen as unworthy, cast aside by her people, had been sold at an auction for a mere $5. At first, Darren didn't understand why his family had chosen such a strange punishment. He thought it might be some sort of joke, but the stern faces of his parents and relatives told him otherwise. His marriage had been arranged for a future date, and Darren wasn't given any option to object. The contract was signed and the decision was final. Days later, Darren found himself on the surface of a distant planet, far away from Earth. He stood in front of a massive structure, an auction hall where the worst criminals and slaves were sold. There was no fanfare, no grand ceremony, just a cold, mechanical process. He couldn't help but feel like a piece of property, just like the alien woman he was about to marry. The woman was being held in a pen. Her clothes were tattered, her skin dirty from years of neglect, and her face was covered in grime. It was clear from the way the others around her looked that she was regarded as worthless, just a slave, a thing to be bought and sold. Her eyes, however, showed something Darren hadn't expected, a fire. They were dark, almost black, but they burned with something that looked like defiance, not fear. Darren was told to approach her, and reluctantly, he walked up to the pen where she stood, waiting. She stood still, her gaze piercing him as he approached. He could feel the weight of her stare, and it made him uncomfortable. Was she judging him? Did she know he was as much a prisoner of fate as she was? "She's yours now," a voice from behind him said, snapping him out of his thoughts. Darren turned to see a gruff-looking man, one of the auction officials, handing him the marriage contract. "You are to take her back with you. Make sure she behaves. She's a troublemaker." Darren nodded, feeling a wave of nausea rise in his throat. This wasn't what he had imagined for himself. He had expected to be punished in some way, but not like this. Not by being forced into a marriage with someone who had no worth in the eyes of society. And yet this was his reality now. The woman didn't speak. She simply stood there, watching him with those cold, defiant eyes. For a moment, Darren wondered if she hated him, if she saw him as just another person who had contributed to her misery. He certainly felt like he was a part of her pain, as though he was about to be bound to someone who had no choice, just as he had none. He took the woman by the arm, the coldness of her touch sending a shiver down his spine. They walked in silence, no words exchanged, as they made their way toward the shuttle that would take them back to the human settlement. As they boarded the craft, Darren's mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. How had it come to this? How had his life fallen so far, so fast? Sitting beside the alien woman, Darren found himself observing her more closely. She was smaller than him, slight in build, with features that were both alien and strangely familiar. Her skin had a pale bluish hue, a feature common to her species. Her hair, long and dark, hung loosely around her shoulders. She was unkempt, to say the least, and the stench that surrounded her was overpowering. It wasn't just the dirt that clung to her. It was something more, a mix of sweat, fear, and a life that had been lived in the shadows. Darren tried to look away, but her gaze was unyielding. She wasn't afraid of him. In fact, it almost seemed like she was daring him to do something. The thought made him uncomfortable. He had expected submission, not defiance. For the rest of the journey, the two sat in silence. The hum of the shuttle's engines was the only sound that filled the air. Darren felt like he was in some sort of nightmare, one he couldn't wake up from. His punishment had been sealed. He was married now, in name and in law, to a woman who had no value in the eyes of the world. When the shuttle finally touched down, Darren didn't know what to do. He had no idea how to interact with this alien woman, or what she even wanted from him. She was an outsider, a slave, and Darren was bound to her, for better or worse. As they walked off the shuttle, he tried to ignore the stares of the people around him. They didn't understand what he was going through, but somehow it felt worse than anything he had ever experienced. The woman didn't look at him. She didn't seem to care about the people around them. She was only focused on the path ahead, her steps quick and purposeful. Darren couldn't help but wonder. What was she thinking? What kind of life had she led to make her so closed off from the world? And as they walked together side by side, Darren realized something that struck him harder than any punishment his family could have devised. He had no idea what he was supposed to do now. Darren had thought that the worst part of his punishment was over when they finally arrived at the human settlement. He was wrong. The real challenge had only just begun. His new wife, as his family had called her, had barely acknowledged him since they landed. She walked beside him, her steps quick and determined, as if she had already accepted her fate. It was as if he were no more than a shadow in her life, an inconvenience to be tolerated, rather than a partner to be respected. Darren had expected some resistance, some reluctance on her part. After all, she had been sold for a mere $5. How could she possibly accept this arrangement without resentment? Yet all he got was silence. It was unsettling, to say the least. They entered their new home, a small, modest house on the edge of the settlement. The house was simple, with bare walls and minimal furniture. It was clear that no one had expected them to live in comfort. Darren felt a sense of emptiness as he stepped inside. This was his new life. He didn't know what to do next, or how to act. The alien woman, whose name he still didn't know, walked straight to a corner of the room and sat down on the floor. She crossed her legs and bowed her head slightly, as if trying to shut out the world around her. Darren stood by the door, unsure of what to say or do. He had never been in a situation like this before, and it was beginning to overwhelm him. For a long time, he simply watched her. She didn't move. She didn't speak. Darren had to admit that he was frustrated. He had expected some sort of acknowledgement from her, perhaps a thank you, or at least a sign of understanding that this was a marriage forced upon them both. But there was nothing. His frustration slowly turned to anger. He didn't want this either. He didn't ask for this life. His family had condemned him to this punishment, and now he had to live with the consequences. He had no idea how to even begin communicating with her. Finally, he cleared his throat, trying to break the silence. "So, what do you want to do now?" he asked awkwardly, his voice low. The question hung in the air between them, but there was no response. The alien woman remained motionless, her face still turned downward. He tried again, this time a bit more forcefully. "We need to talk. We're stuck with each other now, so maybe it's time we figure out how this is going to work." Still, there was no answer. Darren took a few steps closer. He couldn't understand why she was behaving this way. He had expected anger, or maybe tears. But this coldness, this complete lack of response, was something he hadn't anticipated. It only made him feel more isolated, more disconnected from her than ever before. He reached down, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. The contact was brief, but it was enough to break the silence. The woman slowly lifted her head, her eyes meeting his for the first time since they had arrived. There was something about her gaze, something sharp, almost defiant. It sent a chill down his spine. "I'm not your enemy," Darren said, trying to sound calm, though his voice trembled slightly. "I didn't choose this. I don't want to be here either. But we have to figure this out. We don't have any other choice." The woman studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, without a word, she stood up and walked past him, heading toward the small kitchenette in the corner of the room. Darren watched her, unsure of what to make of this sudden change. Was she going to start preparing food? Was she going to leave him to do the rest? She didn't say anything, as she moved about gathering a few simple ingredients and starting to cook. The strange thing was, Darren wasn't sure if she even knew how to cook. Was she just going through the motions, or had she actually learned how to care for herself in this harsh world? As she worked, Darren stood still, unsure of what his role was in this strange situation. He had been given no instructions, no guidance. His family had left him to figure it out on his own. He was, after all, the one who had failed them. He could feel the weight of their disapproval pressing down on him. When the meal was ready, the alien woman placed a simple plate of food in front of him. He didn't know what it was, but it didn't look particularly appetizing. Still, he picked up the fork and took a bite. It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't good either. He didn't know what he had expected, but it wasn't this. The woman didn't sit down with him. She didn't even look at him. Instead, she stood at the far end of the room watching him eat as if she were nothing more than a servant, carrying out her duties without any emotion. Darren could feel the tension in the room. It wasn't just the silence between them, it was the distance, the space that stretched out like a canyon between them, impossible to bridge. "Look," he said finally, setting down his fork. "I don't want this any more than you do. But I have to figure out what happens next. I have to figure out how we survive." The alien woman didn't respond. She didn't even acknowledge him. Darren sighed in frustration, rubbing his face with his hands. What was he supposed to do? He had no idea how to make this work. He was expected to be a husband, but he didn't even know how to start. The hours dragged by in silence, and as night fell, Darren found himself lying awake in the small bed, staring up at the ceiling. He could hear the quiet rustling of the woman in the other corner of the room, but she never came to join him. What had he gotten himself into? And more importantly, what kind of future could he possibly have with someone who saw him as nothing more than a punishment? The days that followed felt like a slow, painful march towards something Darren couldn't quite understand. He had hoped that things might improve with time. But as the weeks passed, the distance between him and his alien wife only seemed to grow wider. The cold silence in their home became unbearable, like a weight pressing down on both of them. Every morning, Darren would wake up alone in his bed. She never joined him. She would sleep in the corner of the room, curled up on the floor like an animal hiding from the world. At first, Darren had tried to talk to her, but his words were met with indifference, as if she couldn't care less. But something had changed in him. He was beginning to see her differently. No longer just a punishment or a burden. He started noticing things about her that intrigued him, things that made him question his initial assumptions. Her strength was undeniable. Despite the way she was treated, despite the conditions she had been forced to endure, she carried herself with a quiet dignity. Darren had seen her in moments of vulnerability, but she never let it show. She held herself together, never allowing anyone to see how much she had suffered. She had learned to survive, to stay strong, even when the world had shown her nothing but cruelty. One day, Darren decided to do something different. He couldn't just sit back and let things stay the way they were. Maybe it was time to try to understand her, to stop seeing her as an alien, a slave, or even as punishment. Maybe, just maybe, she was more than that. He found her sitting by the window, staring out at the distant horizon. The way the light from the setting sun illuminated her face made her appear almost ethereal, like something out of a dream. Her eyes were distant, lost in thought. Darren hesitated for a moment before walking over to her. "Hey," he said softly, sitting down beside her. She didn't look at him, but he could see her tense slightly. For a moment, he wondered if she would tell him to leave, but she didn't. "I know this isn't easy," Darren continued, his voice uncertain, "for both of us. But we have to figure this out. We're stuck with each other, and I think we need to understand each other." The woman didn't speak. She simply stared out the window, her face unreadable. Darren wasn't sure if she was even listening, but he pressed on anyway. "I'm not a bad person," he said. "I don't deserve this either. I didn't ask for any of this, but here we are." For the first time since they had arrived, she glanced at him. Her gaze was sharp, almost challenging, but there was something in it, something more than anger. There was curiosity. "I know you hate me," Darren said quietly, feeling a knot tighten in his chest. "But I don't hate you. I don't even know you. But I want to. I want to understand what happened to you. Why you're here." The woman turned her head slightly, her eyes studying him. Darren couldn't read them, couldn't figure out what she was thinking. She was so closed off, so guarded. But in that moment, he realized that he had been doing the same. He had been treating her like she was a prisoner to his fate, instead of seeing her as someone who had her own story to tell. "I was born into this life," she finally spoke, her voice low and almost hesitant. "I was never given a choice. I've been sold, traded, used by people who saw me as nothing more than an object." Darren felt a pang of guilt. He had assumed she was just a victim of circumstance, but hearing her voice, hearing the pain in her words, made him understand that her story was far more complicated than he had imagined. She continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "But I've learned how to survive. I've had no other choice." Darren didn't know how to respond. He had no words that could make things better, no way to fix what had been broken. But he realized in that moment that this wasn't just about him. This wasn't just about his punishment. It was about her survival, her struggle, her pain. "I'm sorry," he said softly, his voice full of sincerity. "I had no idea." The woman didn't respond. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the window. Darren wasn't sure if she had forgiven him or if she had even heard him. But something had shifted. The ice between them was beginning to crack, just a little. Over the next few days, things began to change. It wasn't immediate, and it certainly wasn't perfect, but Darren began to see small moments of connection. They started eating together, sitting in silence at first, but gradually sharing quiet conversations about their pasts, their hopes, and their fears. The woman, whose name Darren still didn't know, began to open up in small ways. She would ask him questions about Earth, about his family, and his life before all of this. Darren found himself talking more than he ever had before, telling her about his childhood, his family's expectations, and how he had ended up here, far from home. And slowly, as the days passed, Darren started to see a different side of her. She was no longer just the silent, resentful woman he had married out of punishment. She was a person who had been through unimaginable hardship and still found a way to stand strong. One evening, as the two of them sat on the floor, eating the simple meal she had prepared, Darren reached across the table and touched her hand lightly. The woman looked at him surprised but didn't pull away. "I'm sorry for everything," he said again, his voice full of sincerity. "I don't want to be the reason you suffer. I want to make this work." For a moment, there was silence. Then for the first time the woman spoke, her voice soft but clear. "You didn't cause my suffering," she said, her gaze steady. "But you can help me heal." The days began to blur together, each one blending into the next, but Darren felt something change in the air. The heavy silence between him and his alien wife, whose name he had learned was Zara, was slowly being replaced by an uneasy, but undeniable, connection. He didn't fully understand it, and he wasn't sure where it was going, but something inside him told him they were starting to move beyond just surviving. One evening, as they sat in their modest home, Zara was lost in her thoughts. Again, Darren had become used to her quiet moments where she would stare out of the window for long periods, her eyes distant, as though she were somewhere far away. He used to find it unsettling, but now he simply watched her, wondering what was going on in her mind. He had begun to realize how little he truly knew about her past, her pain, her dreams. He knew none of it, and it left a gnawing feeling in his chest. For the first time, he decided to ask her about it. "Zara," he said softly, watching her as she turned her head to face him, "what was life like before all this? Before I came into your life?" Zara's gaze shifted to the window again, and for a long moment she didn't speak. Darren waited, his heart pounding. He had no idea how to approach this, but he knew he needed to understand. There were so many questions he had. About her world, about the people who had taken everything from her. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but steady. I was born on a planet where survival was the only thing that mattered. My people, my family, they were part of a system where strength meant everything. Weakness wasn't allowed. I was born with a condition that made me less than others. And because of that, I was sold. Darren felt his stomach twist with sympathy. He could hardly imagine the kind of life Zara had lived, and the words she spoke sounded almost alien to him. He had never known a life so harsh, so unforgiving. Sold? He asked, his voice a little too sharp. To who? She didn't look at him. To anyone who could pay the price. I was passed from one master to another. Each time the price grew smaller, my value dropping lower. I became nothing more than a piece of property. When I was sold, for $5, I thought that was it. I thought no one would ever see me as anything more than a slave. The weight of her words hung in the air. Darren felt a pang of guilt, knowing that he was part of the system that had allowed this to happen. His punishment was small compared to what she had been through. He wanted to speak, but words failed him. What could he say? Instead, he reached out and placed a hand on hers. The touch was simple, but for Zara it seemed to make her pause just for a second. She didn't pull away, and that in itself felt like a breakthrough. We're not so different, Darren said, his voice steady. I didn't ask for this life either. I didn't ask to be punished. I didn't ask to be forced into a marriage with someone I didn't know. But here we are. Zara looked at him, her eyes meeting his for the first time in what felt like forever. But you're not the same, she said softly. You still have a choice. You still have freedom. Her words stung, but Darren knew she was right. He had choices. He had freedom. He had everything she had lost. And yet, in the strangest way, Zara had taught him something important. That his own freedom was meaningless if it came at the cost of someone else's suffering. I've been thinking, Darren said, his voice low, about how we can make this work. How we can move past all this anger and resentment. You're not my punishment, and I'm not yours. Zara was silent for a moment, as though weighing his words. She seemed to consider something deeply before nodding just slightly. Maybe. But it's not that simple, Darren. We can't just forget everything that's happened. We can't ignore what we've been through. Darren felt a rush of frustration. It was clear to him now that Zara wasn't someone who could just forgive and forget, and he didn't expect her to. But something had shifted. He could feel it. They were no longer strangers bound by force. They were two people trying to make sense of an impossible situation. Then let's start small, Darren said. Let's try to build something together. We don't have to forget our pasts, but we don't have to let them control our future either. Zara looked at him, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, she said nothing. But then, slowly, she gave him the smallest of smiles. It wasn't much, but it was enough to tell him that maybe, just maybe, they were on the right path. Days passed, and with each one, the tension between them began to melt away, though it didn't happen overnight. Zara started to open up more, little by little sharing more about her past and her struggles. She told Darren about the harsh conditions on her home planet, how her family had sold her to survive, and how, despite everything, she had learned to keep her head up. It was painful to hear, but Darren listened, truly listened. He found himself feeling a deep respect for her. The resilience she had shown in the face of unimaginable hardship was something Darren could only hope to emulate. And in turn, Zara seemed to soften toward him, her walls coming down one small brick at a time. One night, after a long day of working together in the fields near their home, they sat by the fire, exhausted but content. Darren looked at Zara, watching her for a moment before speaking. You know, he said, I used to think that this was the worst thing that could ever happen to me. But now, I don't know. I'm starting to think that maybe it's the best thing that could have happened. I've learned so much from you already. Zara turned to him, surprised. What have you learned? I've learned that strength isn't about power or dominance, he said. It's about surviving. It's about going through hell and Coming out the other side, still standing, Zara smiled again, this time more openly. "You're not so bad, Darren." And in that moment, Darren realized something important. Maybe they didn't need to be a perfect match. Maybe they didn't need to change the world or forget the past. All they needed was to move forward, together, step by step. And that, Darren thought, might just be enough. Weeks passed and something remarkable happened. The home that once felt cold and distant now held a different energy. It wasn't just the changing seasons or the warmth of the fire in the hearth. It was the shift between Darren and Zara. Their conversations had grown deeper, their moments together more comfortable. The tension had faded, replaced by something that felt like understanding. Darren no longer saw Zara as the punishment he had once believed her to be. And Zara, though she never said it out loud, had started to let go of the bitterness that had held her captive for so long. She had begun to see him differently too. He was no longer the privileged man whose family had condemned her. He was simply Darren, a man who, like her, was trying to make sense of a world that had been unkind. One evening after a long day spent working on the farm, Darren sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Zara was nearby, tending to a pot of soup she had made with the last of their supplies. The smell filled the room, making Darren's stomach growl. They had learned to make do with what little they had, but it was enough. They had enough. "Are you ever going to tell me how you ended up in that auction?" Darren asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. He had been meaning to ask her for a while, but it had never seemed like the right time. Now, as they shared this quiet evening, he finally felt ready. Zara's hands paused in their work, and for a moment Darren wondered if she would refuse to answer. But then she turned to him, her expression softening. "I've told you bits and pieces," she said quietly, her voice distant. "But the truth is, it's hard to talk about. It's not easy to admit that I was sold like an object, like something disposable." Darren shifted closer, his tone gentle. "You don't have to tell me everything, but I think it's important that we both understand what we've been through. We've both lost so much, and I don't want to be a stranger to you anymore." Zara looked down at the soup, stirring it slowly. The firelight flickered across her face, casting shadows that made her look even more distant. After a long pause, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "My family, they had no choice but to sell me," she began. "I was born with a condition that made me different. Where I come from, you're either strong enough to survive or you're discarded. My family couldn't afford to keep me. They couldn't afford the medicine I needed, so they sold me to the highest bidder." Darren's heart sank. He had known Zara had endured hardships, but hearing it in her own words made it feel real. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't imagine how that must have felt." Zara shrugged, but her eyes betrayed the pain she felt. "It's hard to explain. Every part of me was used, sold, until I had nothing left. They told me I wasn't worth anything, but I learned how to survive. I learned how to keep going, even when it seemed like I was nothing." Darren was silent for a moment, reflecting on her words. He thought about his own life, how sheltered it had been compared to hers. His family had never treated him like that. But he understood now that it wasn't just the external circumstances that defined them. It was how they had both dealt with those circumstances. Zara had survived by becoming strong, but Darren had been broken, lost, and had no idea how to rebuild. "I admire your strength," Darren said, breaking the silence. "You've been through so much, and yet, here you are, still standing. I don't think I could have done the same." Zara turned to him, meeting his gaze for the first time that evening. There was something in her eyes, something softer, more vulnerable than he had ever seen before. It made him realize how much she had been hiding, not just from him, but from the world. "I don't know if it's strength," she replied softly. "I think it's just survival. I didn't have a choice. But I'm glad you see me for more than just a slave or a punishment. I've spent so long being seen as less than. It's nice to be seen for who I really am." Darren reached out, gently touching her arm. "You are more than that. You're You're everything. Zara looked at his hand, then back at his face. She hesitated for a moment, and then for the first time she smiled. It was small, but it reached her eyes, lighting up her face in a way that made Darren's heart race. The smile faded just as quickly, but it lingered in the air between them. There was a shift in the way they looked at each other now. They weren't just two people thrown together by fate anymore. They were starting to understand each other, starting to care about each other in ways they hadn't expected. The days that followed were filled with small, quiet moments. Darren found himself waking up earlier than usual, ready to help with whatever task needed doing. Zara, in turn, seemed to be more at ease with him, no longer keeping to herself in the corner of the room. They worked together side by side, each day making their bond stronger. One afternoon, as they took a break from their work, Darren looked at Zara and asked, "What do you dream about, Zara? What do you hope for?" Zara sat down beside him, gazing out at the vast landscape before them. For a moment she said nothing, as though the question had taken her by surprise. But then she spoke, her voice softer than usual. "I dream about freedom," she said quietly. "Not just for me, but for everyone like me. I dream about a world where people like me aren't treated like property, where we can live freely without fear of being sold or discarded." Darren nodded, understanding the depth of her words. "And what about us? What do you want for us?" Zara turned to face him, her eyes searching his. There was a long pause before she spoke, and when she did, her words were quiet, but filled with sincerity. "I want peace," she said. "I want to stop running from the past and start living in the present. I want to build something with you, Darren. Something real." Darren smiled, feeling his heart swell with emotion. He had never imagined that this could happen, that they could find something real in the midst of all the pain. But now, as he sat beside Zara, he realized that they were both building something together, something that mattered. "We can do that," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "Together." Darren woke to the soft sound of birds singing outside their modest home. The early morning light filtered through the small window, casting a warm glow over the room. For a brief moment, he simply lay there, listening to the sounds of the world waking up around him. It was peaceful, quieter than he had ever expected life to be after everything that had happened. He turned to look at Zara, who was still asleep beside him. She had stopped sleeping on the floor months ago, gradually moving closer to him as the months passed. Now they shared the bed as equals, side by side. The warmth between them was something that Darren hadn't known he needed, but it felt like everything was falling into place. Zara's face was peaceful in sleep, her features relaxed, a far cry from the tense and guarded woman she had been when they first met. He hadn't known what to expect when this punishment had begun, but he never would have imagined that he would find this kind of peace, this kind of connection. As he watched her, Darren smiled to himself. Life had changed in ways he hadn't expected. They had built a life together, one step at a time. From the cold, awkward days of forced marriage to this warm, quiet moment, everything had transformed. They were no longer just two strangers forced together by circumstance. They were partners, friends, and in the most unexpected way, they had found something that resembled love. He gently pulled the blanket back, careful not to wake her, and rose from the bed. As he walked toward the small kitchen, he reflected on how far they had come. The house they lived in was still small, simple, but it was theirs. They had created something from nothing, just the two of them, working together. The garden outside had flourished under their care. What had once been barren soil was now bursting with fresh vegetables and flowers. Zara had taught him how to tend to it, showing him the little tricks that she had learned over the years. The physical labor had been hard, but it had brought them closer. There was something deeply satisfying about watching something grow, knowing they had nurtured it together. As he started preparing breakfast, Darren heard the soft sound of footsteps behind him. He turned around to see Zara standing in the doorway, her eyes still sleepy but filled with warmth. She smiled at him, a smile that had become more familiar, more comfortable with time. "Good morning," she said, her voice still husky from sleep. "Morning," Darren replied, his voice full of affection. "I made breakfast." Zara walked over to him, pausing as she glanced at the simple meal he had begun to prepare. "Smells good," she said. "You're getting better at this." Darren laughed softly, feeling a warmth spread through him. "I'm still no expert, but I'm trying." She reached out, gently touching his arm, a gesture that was small but meaningful. "You're doing fine." They sat down together to eat, the meal simple but satisfying. As they ate, Darren found himself thinking about how much their lives had changed. They had both learned to adapt, to grow, to create something new from the pieces of their past. They had faced their demons, and now, in the quiet of the morning, there was peace. It wasn't perfection, but it was enough. It was everything. "So," Darren began, breaking the silence. "What do we do now?" Zara raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we've come this far," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "We've built this life, and now what?" Zara thought for a moment before answering. "Now, we live," she said simply. "We keep building, keep growing, together." Darren smiled, the weight of her words settling over him. It was a simple answer, but it was the truth. They had spent so long surviving, so long trying to get by, but now they had reached a point where they could live, really live. There was no more fighting for survival, no more struggling against the past. They had created a future, and it was theirs to shape. Later that day, as they worked together in the garden, Darren realized that their bond had become stronger than he had ever imagined. The connection they shared now wasn't just based on the necessity of survival. It was built on respect, on understanding, and most of all, on trust. As they pulled weeds from the soil, working side by side, Zara turned to Darren with a smile. "You know, I never thought I'd have a life like this. I never thought I'd have anything." Darren stopped what he was doing, looking at her with a soft expression. "I never thought I'd find happiness in a place like this," he said, his voice full of honesty. "But I have, and it's because of you." Zara's smile grew wider, and she reached out to touch his hand, her fingers brushing against his. The simple touch sent a rush of warmth through Darren's chest. He had never expected to feel so connected to another person, let alone someone who had been nothing more than a stranger in his life. But now, he couldn't imagine life without her. They stood there for a moment, just looking at each other. There was no need for words. They had both come so far, and they understood each other in a way that no one else could. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the land, Darren took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything they had achieved together. They had both been broken, both scarred by their pasts, but in each other they had found something beautiful, something worth fighting for. "I used to think that this was just a punishment," Darren said, his voice thoughtful. "But now, I know it's not. It's a chance for us to make something good from all the bad. And I think we're doing that." Zara nodded, her eyes shining with emotion. "I think we are." As the night fell around them, the two of them sat side by side, the world quiet and peaceful. They had built something together, something real. They had found each other in the midst of the chaos, and in doing so, they had created a life that was worth living. In the end, they realized that happiness wasn't something that could be given or taken. It was something they had built together step by step, and as long as they had each other, they knew that they could face anything the world threw their way.